The Journal of John Woolman, a Quaker, and other selected writings. Hello, I'm Malcolm Cox and welcome to What We're Reading, episode 44. Today I want to talk about a book I finished recently, the Journal of the aforementioned John Woolman. This chap, John Woolman, lived in the 18th century, somewhere in the middle of the century, running up to the period of the American War of Independence. He died in the 1770s, I believe. And it's an interesting book. I can't remember how I came across it. I think it was referenced in another book I've been reading. Either I've been reading one about racism, in fact two might have been from there, or it could have been from a devotional book, because his writings are considered to be a bit of a devotional classic. His own self-reflection on what God is teaching him comes through very strongly in his journals. He's writing there about what he perceives to be the way that God is moving and working in him to prompt him to go one place over another, speak to one person over another, when to speak to them. There's a lot of really interesting self-reflection there in a prayerful and meditative way. It's one of the reasons I read the book. But the issue that drew me to the book was that I knew he wrote about slavery in the 18th century, at a time before abolition. And I thought it might be insightful to be exposed to the thinking of someone who developed a settled opposition to slavery. He was very strong in his views on that. But at a time when opposition to slavery was not a mainstream movement. There were others thinking that way, but it was very much a minority view at the time. Now, having read the book, I have to say, I think if I'd known him, I don't think I'd have liked him, but I would have admired him. He's definitely a strong-willed character, certainly someone who wasn't afraid to buck the trend, much to admire, if not necessary to like, in some of the ways that he conducted himself, I would say. But we all need people like this in the community we have. Like in every church, it seems to me we need at least one person like this, who's full of conviction and prepared to go all the way down the line following their convictions, which is what we see from his journal. As an example of his independent thinking, let me give you this thought from his conviction about the purchase of dyeing one's clothes. The editor to the edition I've been reading writes this: "It was difficult to disregard a man who wore conspicuous white clothes rather than use dyes which had to be produced by slave labor. John Woolman was the gentle conscience of Quakerism." That comes from the introduction to the book. By the way, I read the Kindle version, which I seem to remember was something like 99p. So if you want to get the book, that might be the cheapest and easiest way to get it. Now for this review today, for what I want to share with us, I'm going to pick out two issues from his journals. There's much to reflect on in there, but just two things which spoke to me. The first is his attitude towards slavery, and the second is his approach to confronting his fellow believing Quakers on the issue. So first of all, let's take his views on slavery. It's clear that he reflected carefully on his feelings and his thinking all through his adult life, in particular on the issue of slavery. He paid careful attention to his feelings, to what was going on in he would describe as his spirit and his conscience. Consider this quote from the second chapter of the journal. He says this: "When I ate, drank, and lodged free cost with people who lived in ease in the hard labor of their slaves, I felt uneasy. And as my mind was inward to the Lord, I found this uneasiness return upon me at times through the whole visit." Here is someone who is uneasy but pays attention, notes it, writes it in his journal, and ultimately does something with it. Not someone who's trying to have a comfortable life or an easy life or deny what he's truly feeling in that particular situation. And his concern wasn't just for himself. He was thinking about posterity, about future generations. He writes this about those who were embracing the ownership of slaves. He says, though now many willingly run into it, yet in future the consequence will be grievous to posterity. Grievous, well, I think we can all see the consequences of that. He was not wrong. He was proven right time and time again. Now, of the many motivations for the ownership of slaves, he observed that greed was one of them, perhaps the principal one amongst them all. He writes this in chapter 4 of his journal. The love of ease and gain are the motives in general in keeping slaves, and men are wont to take hold of weak arguments to support a cause which is unreasonable. John was deeply touched by and troubled by the acquisition of luxury for the tiny minority produced at the expense of the slaves. He says this in chapter 4 again, these are the people by whose labour the other inhabitants are in great measure supported, and many of them in the luxuries of life. These are the people who have made no agreement to serve us. He's talking about the slaves there. They've not made an agreement to serve us, and who have not forfeited their liberty that we know of. In other words, didn't do it voluntarily. These are the souls for whom Christ died. And for our conduct towards them, we must answer before him who is no respecter of persons. One of his great laments in his journal is the fact that those who are those slaves owned by Christians should be seeing a different perspective from them, but aren't. What impressed me about John's perspective is that it was the minority view at the time. He was blazing a trail for the others that came after him, and he had some contemporaries, of course, but he was still very much in that minority. There was no abolitionist movement to speak of, at least where he lived, at least not a strong one. And his convictions came just from his own heart, his own mind, his own spirit, deep from within him. Let's move on to the second aspect of this chap, John, who I admire very much, and that's on how he spoke to his fellow believers about these issues of slavery. He was realistic about the challenges that he faced, trying to persuade his fellow believers, who are also Quakers, to reconsider their ownership of slaves. And not all Quakers did own slaves. In fact, I would imagine it was probably only the minority. But nonetheless, there were some, and they were often prominent in their congregations. And how do you deal with that? How do you approach people on such a sensitive topic when they are well established and you are some almost nobody really? He didn't have any money. He lived very frugally. He was not particularly well educated, though reasonably well, but not particularly well. How did he deal with this? He determined to pursue speaking to his fellow believers as an aspect of his duty. He says this in chapter 3. Deep-rooted customs, though wrong, are not easily altered, but it is the duty of all to be firm in that which they certainly know is right for them. It's the duty of all to be firm in that which they certainly know is right. So just because something's difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't do what is right. And that's how he felt, and that's how he conducted himself. He was also realistic and clear about the fact that he wasn't going to be able to please everybody. He made some enemies along the way. In chapter 3 again, I saw at this time that if I was honest in declaring that which truth opened to me, I could not please all men. And I laboured to be content in the way of my duty, however disagreeable to my own inclination. In other words, even though I didn't feel like doing it, even though I didn't want to do it, it was my duty, and I laboured to be content. And a lot of that labour was in prayer. He talks a lot about praying, to have the right spirit, the right attitude in talking to his fellow believers, and to have contentment and trust in God that whatever came of it all, that God was with him and God would vindicate him and God would strengthen him for what he needed to do. He said this also, "I find that to be a fool as to worldly wisdom and to commit my cause to God, not fearing to offend men who take offense at the simplicity of truth, is the only way to remain unmoved at the sentiments of others." So often for myself, I'm worried about how people are going to react when I say something, and perhaps you can relate to this. But he says here, and it's not that he didn't feel these things, because when you read the journal, he felt this very strongly. He was afraid. But he said, I need to commit my cause to God, not fear those people just because they take offense at what is true. That's the only way to remain unmoved at the sentiments of others. I hope to grow in being someone more confident in God, such that I can speak the truth without fear of the consequences. John Woolman is an inspiration in that. He also saw that speaking the truth in love was part of genuine friendship and real brotherhood. He's got a real concern about true unity, as Jesus prayed for in John chapter 17. A part of it is speaking the truth. He says this in chapter 7, "To see the failings of our friends and to think hard of them." In other words, they really ought to be changing here. This isn't right. "To see the failings of our friends and to think hard of them without opening that which we ought to open." In other words, without being honest, without talking about it, and still carry a face of friendship, like a pretense, tends to undermine the foundation of true unity. And there's an understatement. So when we see someone failing, when we see someone who really should be behaving differently, and then we don't open up, we don't talk, we don't reveal, we don't confront, we don't discuss, and still carry on pretending like we're friends, there's a problem, but we're friends, it undermines the foundation of true unity. How true that is, it undermines it. It digs away underneath at what Jesus prayed for in John chapter 17. So I'm going to stop there because there's a lot I could say about this journal, and it was really good for me to see someone with a deep conviction about an issue like slavery at that time in the 18th century, and also to see the way that he processed and thought about, and then indeed did confront many of his friends, and that's the details of that are in the journal. I think my spirit was very refreshed by his courage to be real with God, with himself, and with everybody else. And also, just how long he would spend in prayer and reflection. He'd often pray all night, he'd think about and pray about talking to somebody about something, and then he might go to see them, but then come back without speaking because he felt in his spirit it wasn't the right time. He might go back another time. It might be the next day, it might be a week, it might be a month, or several months might go by because he's not settled in his spirit that God has given him the strength, or in a sense the not quite permission, but the insight to know, the discernment to know that this is the right time. And then he'll go back when he perceives it to be the right time. And often he's praying not only a lot, but sometimes all night, many times with tears, and with just a deep passion and a concern that he gets the timing right. And he speaks the right words, essentially with the right spirit. That concerned him a great deal. And that helped me to think about the fact that it's not a good thing to be impatient to say something. It's important to have my spirit in the right place, but it's also important not to put it off just because I want to keep the peace. Really good thoughts here in his journals. There's much to admire and much to learn from in the journals. I'm not sure I'm going to recommend it to you, generally speaking, as my listenership, as a book to read. The reason is not because there's anything bad in it, but it was written in the 18th century and the language is somewhat archaic. Many of the terms have changed their meanings, or words have changed their meaning, so it's a bit of a hard slog to read through it. I had to read slowly, I had to read with concentration. You may enjoy it. And if you're not put off by the language issue, then I'd certainly recommend it. If you think that's going to be a bit tough for you, well, maybe that's not the book for you. But nonetheless, I'm glad I pushed myself through it and got there in the end. I do really appreciate the fact that we can get books so easily these days. 99p on a Kindle, and I can open it and read it anytime I like and make notes, which I've done for this, well, for myself, but then for this recording. So I'd love to know what you're reading. What are you reading that's helping you, that's opening up your mind and your heart to new ideas? Drop me a line, let me know, because maybe I'll read it myself. The email is malcolm@malcolmcox.org, and you can leave a message anywhere you hear or see this recording on my website, malcolmcox.org, or anywhere on YouTube. So please do let me know what you're reading. And also, if you read this book, I'd love to know what you think. What do you get out of it? You might get very different things from it compared to me, which is fine. And we need to learn from each other anyway. So that's what I have for you this week. John Woolman, Journal of a Quaker. Fascinating chap from a different time who refreshed me greatly. Until the next time, take care and God bless.